Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm 74 years old, and on the day my son got married, I stood at the back of the reception hall in a plain navy dress I had already worn to two other family weddings before it, smiling the way mothers are supposed to smile, holding a small glass of champagne I never once actually sipped, my feet aching quietly inside shoes I had bought on sale years earlier, while nobody in that room, not my son, not his new bride, not one single relative eating that expensive plated dinner under those rented string lights knew that I was the sole owner of the company that had quietly put nearly every one of them through college, through braces, through their first cars, through more medical emergencies than I could count on both hands over the years. I never said a single word that whole night, not one. I had my reasons, good ones, reasons built up slowly over 11 long years of careful silence, and by the end of this story tonight you will understand exactly what those reasons were and exactly why I chose to carry them alone for so long, telling almost nobody, not even my own son. It started long before the wedding, really, on a gray, damp Tuesday morning in March 11 years earlier, the year my husband Robert died after a long, quiet fight with his heart. I sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Columbus, still wearing black, still smelling faintly of the lilies from his funeral 2 days before, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone completely white, and I heard, for the very first time in my whole married life, that the company he had built with his own two rough, calloused hands, Ellison Tool and Die, belonged entirely, 100% to me, not to our son David. Not to some board of men in suits who had never once in 40 years asked my opinion on anything of real consequence. To me, Margaret Ellison, the very same woman everyone in that family had spent decades treating like she barely understood a checkbook, let alone a full balance sheet running into 7 figures. I remember driving home from that lawyer's office with the windows down, even though it was barely 50 degrees outside that day, the cold air biting at my face, crying so hard I had to pull over twice on the gravel shoulder of Route 40, my hands shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I could barely hold it steady, thinking over and over again in that quiet car, nobody needs to know this but me. Not yet. Maybe not for a very long time. Maybe not ever. I did not decide that out of pride, and I want you to understand that clearly. I decided it out of a lifetime of small, specific, remembered moments. Moments where I had watched exactly how people in my own family treated any woman they believed had nothing meaningfully of her own to protect. Have you ever kept a secret not out of shame, and not because you actually had something shameful to hide, but simply because you already knew, with a certainty that sat low in your stomach like a swallowed stone, exactly how people around you would use that information against you the very moment they found out about it? If you have ever carried a secret like that yourself, or if you are simply the kind of person who loves a story where the quietest one in the room turns out in the end to be the strongest one there all along, then do me a small favor right now and hit that subscribe button. It does not cost you a single cent, not 1 penny out of your pocket, and it is honestly the only thing that keeps a small channel like this one able to keep finding and telling true, real stories like mine, the kind of stories nobody else out there seems especially interested in telling anymore. And while you are at it, please tell me down in the comments where exactly you are listening from tonight, what city, what small town, what country. Because in just a few minutes I am going to tell you precisely what my own daughter-in-law tried to quietly take from me at my son's wedding, and I truly want to know who is sitting with me, listening closely, when it finally happens. My name, back then, long before I was anybody's grandmother, long before I was anybody's widow, was simply Margaret Doyle, a girl from a small, drafty clapboard house on the edge of Dayton, Ohio, the only daughter of a mill worker and a seamstress who never had 2 spare dollars to rub together in the same calendar month, not once, not in all the years I lived under their roof. I married a young machinist named Robert Ellison in the spring of 1974 because he had kind, steady eyes and an actual plan for his life, even though nobody in either of our two families believed in that plan yet, least of all his own father, who called it foolishness openly to a young man's own face. At our modest engagement dinner, Robert started that company in a rented cinder block garage on the outskirts of town, with 2 second-hand lathes he bought cheap at a bankruptcy auction and a $5,000 loan his own father grudgingly co-signed, warning him twice in front of me that he would lose every single cent of it inside a year. I kept the books at our kitchen table every single night for 11 straight years before we could even afford a proper office downtown, doing the arithmetic by lamplight after David had finally gone to sleep down the hall, and not one soul outside that small, cramped kitchen ever knew how many of the truly big decisions, the ones that genuinely could have sunk us for good, actually got made right there, over cold coffee and stacks of yellow legal pads, in a woman's own careful handwriting that nobody outside that house ever once saw or asked about. By the time Robert finally passed, quietly, in his own bed, after that long fight with his heart, Ellison Tool and Die employed 140 people spread across 3 different states, supplying precision-machined parts to companies most people driving down any American highway have actually heard of at some point. And I owned every single share of it entirely in my own name, because Robert had always trusted me completely with the numbers without question, without hesitation, even when the rest of the world, including our own grown son, simply assumed I was just the pleasant wife who answered the shop phones and remembered everyone's birthday with a card. Those first 2 years after Robert's funeral were the hardest of my entire life, harder even than raising David through all his teenage troubles. Because I was grieving my husband of 37 years, while also quietly learning to run a 140-person company from a modest back office nobody in the family ever bothered to visit. I did most of it through Ruth, on the phone, in the evenings, so nobody would ever notice how many calls I was actually making during the day. There was one winter, our second largest supplier out of Cincinnati threatened to pull out entirely over a late shipment that was not even our fault, and I sat at my own kitchen table at 11 at night, the same table where I had once done Robert's books by lamplight, and I personally talked that man down over the phone until he agreed to give us 60 more days. Nobody in my family ever knew that phone call happened. Nobody ever asked. My son David is a good man in his heart. I still believe that, even now, even after everything I'm about to tell you. But 3 years after his father passed, he married a woman named Vanessa Prescott. His second marriage, after a brief and genuinely painful first marriage in his 20s, had given him a son, Caleb, who from the very time he could first talk called me Grandma Margie, and never once in his whole life needed a reason to come visit me on a Sunday. Vanessa came from a family living in the Brookhaven section of town, the kind of neighborhood that measured a person's entire worth almost solely by the size of their driveway and the make of the car parked gleaming inside it. And from the very first Thanksgiving I ever hosted for her, she looked around slowly at my little house on Larkspur Lane, the one Robert and I bought brand new back in 1976, and never once felt the need to upgrade. And she looked me over, standing there in a 10-year-old cardigan I still loved, and I watched her make up her entire mind about exactly who I was in under 30 seconds flat. It started small, the way these things almost always do, so small at first that you can easily talk yourself out of even noticing it for months at a stretch. Vanessa would mention, gently, almost sweetly over coffee, she always brought herself in a paper cup, because she never quite trusted the cleanliness of my own mugs. How much easier my life would apparently be in one of those nice retirement communities out past Brookhaven, the ones with the little shuttle bus and the shared dining hall and the tidy garden plots out back, and how a woman my age really should not be climbing stairs alone anymore, should not be driving herself around at night anymore, should absolutely not be handling her own monthly bills without somebody responsible watching closely over her shoulder, just in case something went wrong. I would smile at her, the same patient smile I have used on difficult people my entire life, and I would say, quite plainly, that I was doing just fine on my own. Thank you kindly, and she would smile right back at me and say, "Of course, Margaret, of course you are doing fine." But there was always a small but folded quietly into that very sentence, always a tiny pause underneath it that seemed to say, "Your version of fine is simply not the same as my version of fine." That seemed to say I have already privately decided something firm about you, and I am simply waiting, patiently, politely, for you to eventually catch up to my own decision. David started saying similar things too after a while, in that careful, rehearsed voice grown children sometimes use when they have practiced a difficult conversation out loud in the car on the entire drive over, sometimes twice through, sometimes even scribbling themselves a small note on a napkin beforehand. "Mom, we just worry so much about you out here alone on this quiet street. Mom, it might genuinely be time to think seriously about downsizing while you still have some real choice in the matter. Mom, Vanessa found this wonderful place with a long waiting list. We would just need you to sign a few simple forms so we could put down a deposit before somebody else on that list takes the open spot instead." Deposit for exactly what, I would ask, as calmly and evenly as I could possibly manage each time, and the answer was always vague, always wrapped tightly in so much performed concern that saying no out loud felt almost cruel, like I was rejecting my own son's genuine love, instead of simply rejecting his wife's quiet, ongoing campaign for control over decisions that were still, both legally and morally, entirely mine alone to make for myself. What honestly hurt the most through all of this was never the suggestions themselves. It was the particular tone folded quietly underneath every single one of them. A tone that said, without ever once saying it plainly out loud, "We have already decided among ourselves that you cannot truly be trusted with your own life anymore. We are simply being patient while you slowly catch up to that fact yourself in your own time." I had raised that boy entirely alone through 3 separate surgeries on his father's back, through 2 brutal recessions that nearly closed our factory doors for good, through a house fire in 1989 that took our whole garage and half our life savings in one single terrible Tuesday night while David slept safely at a neighbor's house. And now he sat across my own kitchen table, in the very house where I had survived every one of those things, speaking to me gently, like I was a small child who had wandered too far from the yard and simply needed guiding patiently back home. Vanessa started referring openly to my finances in front of other people, casually, almost cheerfully, at church on Sunday mornings, at the grocery store while we waited in the checkout line, once even at my own hairdresser's chair, while I sat there completely trapped with foils folded into my hair, unable to politely excuse myself and leave, Yasmin me, saying things like, "We just want to make absolutely sure Margaret's little pension stretches far enough for her every single month. We worry constantly about her becoming a real burden on David down the road when she can least afford it financially." She said every word of it with such genuinely convincing warmth in her voice that anyone merely overhearing her would have sworn on a whole stack of family Bibles that she was the single kindest, most devoted daughter-in-law in the entire state of Ohio. A burden. That particular word sat lodged in my chest like a swallowed stone for weeks afterward, showing up uninvited while I stood washing the dinner dishes alone, while I lay trying to fall asleep at night, while I stood frozen in the cereal aisle, deciding between 2 nearly identical brands purely out of old habit rather than any real budget concern. I had personally signed the checks that quietly paid for this entire family's Christmases, its orthodontist bills, its first cars, and every one of its college tuitions for 40 straight years running, and now I was being calmly discussed out loud in public at a hair salon of all places, like some troublesome line item that somebody responsible needed to carefully plan around going forward. At my 73rd birthday dinner, held at David and Vanessa's house that year instead of mine for the first time ever, Vanessa handed me a small gift bag after the cake, smiling brightly in front of the whole table, and inside it, wrapped in tissue paper like a genuine present, were 3 glossy brochures for assisted living facilities, each one with little sticky notes marking the rooms she thought I would like best. She said she had spent weeks researching them, just for me, out of love, and everyone at that table clapped softly and told me how lucky I was to have such a thoughtful daughter-in-law looking out for me. I thanked her, and I smiled, and I put those brochures in my kitchen drawer when I got home, underneath the phone book, where they sat for years without ever once being opened again. Around that same time, David stopped inviting me to what he used to call our little planning talks. The yearly conversations we had always had together about the holidays, about family money matters, about which relatives needed a little extra help that year and which did not. Vanessa had quietly taken his seat on those conversations instead, and one November I found out entirely by accident, through a cousin, that the whole family had already decided together where Christmas dinner would be held that year, and who was cooking what, and how much everyone was contributing toward the caterer, without a single person thinking to call and ask me anything at all. I sat with that phone call for a long while after it ended, staring at my own kitchen wall, feeling something I can only describe as being quietly erased from my own family's calendar. One small decision at a time. I called David that same week gently and asked why nobody had thought to include me, and he sounded genuinely surprised, almost defensive, saying Vanessa had simply been trying to take things off my plate since I always seemed so busy with my own little errands these days. My own little errands, as if driving myself to the bank, to the pharmacy, to my standing Tuesday lunch with two old friends from the neighborhood, amounted to some kind of full schedule that needed protecting me from a simple phone call about Christmas dinner. I did not argue with him. I simply said I would love to be included next time, and he said, of course, Mom, of course, in a tone that told me he had already forgotten the conversation by the time we hung up. I never corrected her. Not even once, not even quietly, not even in moments when it would have been so remarkably easy to simply say one true sentence out loud and watch her entire practice performance collapse right there in front of everyone at that salon in an instant. Because the moment I corrected her, the very moment anyone in that family finally learned what Ellison Tool and Die was actually worth on paper, and whose single name alone sat printed on every share certificate locked inside that filing cabinet, the questions would never truly stop coming, not for the rest of my natural life, and I already knew, deep in my bones, in that same old place where I still carried the memory of my own mother being quietly talked over at her own kitchen table decades earlier, exactly what kind of questions those would eventually turn out to be. Caleb was the one exception to all of it, even back then, before any of this had come to a head. He was maybe 19 at the time, home from his second year of community college, and I remember him sitting at my kitchen table one afternoon while Vanessa was in the next room on the phone with a real estate agent about senior living options she had not even asked me about yet, and he leaned over and said quietly, "Grandma, you know none of us actually asked you what you want, right?" And I laughed and told him not to worry about it, that I was just fine. And he looked at me for a long moment, the way only a 19-year-old who genuinely sees you can look at a person, and said, "I don't think that's true, but okay." He never pushed me on it again, but he never stopped noticing either, and I never forgot that he was the only one who had asked. So I let them all believe whatever made them most comfortable to believe. I kept living small, deliberately on purpose, clipping coupons I did not strictly need to clip anymore, driving my same old sedan long past the point where I could have easily afforded 3 brand new ones outright in cash, because a woman who lives quietly and modestly is a woman that nobody around her ever bothers to investigate too closely. And I had already decided somewhere back in that lawyer's office 11 long years earlier that I would always prefer being quietly underestimated over being openly managed by people who thought they knew better than me. The wedding planning began in earnest that following spring, and with it came 100 brand new chances for Vanessa to remind everyone gently and repeatedly exactly where she personally believed I stood in this family's unofficial pecking order. She drove up to my house one bright Saturday morning in a brand new white Range Rover her own father had bought her as an early engagement present, the fine leather seat still smelling faintly of the dealership showroom, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist that must have cost more money than I paid outright for my very first car back in 1971. And she stood there in my modest little living room asking, with what genuinely sounded like real pity in her voice, whether I would even be comfortable enough to attend the engagement party at the country club, given how overwhelming these kinds of grand events could apparently be, in her own careful words, for someone in my particular situation in life. My situation. As if being 74 years old and quietly widowed for 11 years running was some kind of diagnosis printed neatly on a medical chart somewhere, instead of simply being the plain fact of having lived long enough to lose the one man you had truly loved since you were 22 years old and still quietly ache for on soft, slow Sunday afternoons even now. I went to that engagement party anyway. Dressed in a modest dress I had owned faithfully since Robert's own retirement dinner years before, and I stood near the open bar making polite small talk while I watched Vanessa's mother introduce me warmly to her country club friends as David's mother. She keeps to herself mostly, bless her heart, in a tone so practiced and so quietly pitying that 3 separate women I had genuinely never once met in my entire life reached over unbidden and patted my hand gently, the exact way you might comfort a small lost child who had wandered too far from her own parents inside a crowded department store on a busy Saturday. Later that same evening, Vanessa's aunt, a woman named Patricia, who I had met exactly twice before in my whole life, sat down beside me at the bar with a glass of white wine and asked quite kindly whether I had somebody helping me manage things at home now that I was on my own. Someone to help with the driving, the paperwork, the little day-to-day things. When I said no, that I managed everything myself just fine, she patted my knee and said, "Well, you know, there is no shame in needing a little help at your age. David and Vanessa clearly have it handled for you, and you should just let them." I nodded and smiled and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say to a woman who had already decided before ever really meeting me exactly how capable I was allowed to be. That evening turned out to be the very first truly big humiliation of that entire engagement season, and I will admit it to you plainly right now. That night I sat alone in my car, in my own dark driveway, underneath the very same porch light Robert had installed with his own hands back in 1981. And I cried harder than I honestly had in years, because being openly pitied by total strangers for a life I had actually built with my own 2 hands brick by brick, decision by careful decision, hurt in a way I genuinely had not expected, to still feel this deeply and this personally at my age. If any part of this story sounds even a little familiar to you tonight, if you have ever sat quietly in a room being talked about instead of being talked to directly, being gently managed instead of simply being asked, "I want you to stay with me through the rest of what happened," and if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do. It truly costs nothing at all, and every single subscriber quietly tells us that stories about women like me are genuinely worth telling all the way through to the very end. Where are you listening from tonight, by the way? Tell me down in the comments below. I promise you honestly that I read every single one of them before I finally go to sleep each night. It was almost exactly 2 weeks after that engagement party that I overheard something I was truly never supposed to hear at all. I had driven over to David and Vanessa's new house on a warm Wednesday evening to drop off a chicken casserole, the very same recipe I had made faithfully every single week since David was a small boy, and the side kitchen door had been propped open against the summer heat, and I clearly heard Vanessa on the phone with her own father saying, quite plainly and matter-of-factly, "Once we are officially married, David and I really do need to get ahead of this whole thing properly, get power of attorney fully set up before she declines any further, so that we are not left scrambling helplessly later once she truly cannot make her own decisions for herself anymore at all." Decline. That particular word again, spoken so casually, so clinically, exactly like I was some stock price quietly dipping on a quarterly earnings report, and not a living, breathing woman standing barely 30 feet away with a warm casserole dish growing steadily heavier in my aching arms. I stood outside that propped open door for a full minute, maybe even longer, listening closely to my own future daughter-in-law calmly plan out my eventual incapacity to her own father, in that same casual tone of voice she might have easily used to schedule a routine home inspection on a house she already, quietly and confidently, considered entirely her own property. I stood there a moment longer than I probably should have, remembering, oddly, A night nearly 50 years earlier, when Robert had come home from the garage past midnight exhausted and told me quietly that his own father had said the exact same thing about him once, that a man who could not manage a simple loan properly should not be trusted running a business at all. Robert had proven his own father wrong over 4 decades of steady work. I decided, standing there outside that propped open door with a cooling casserole in my arms, that I still had time to prove somebody wrong, too, on my own terms whenever I finally chose to. I did not confront her that particular night, not right there at her own kitchen door. I set the warm casserole down gently on the back step instead, turned around slowly and drove all the way home in complete silence with the radio switched off, and somewhere along that dark, familiar drive down roads I had personally known for over 50 years of my life, something deep inside me shifted quietly, quiet and final as an old lock finally turning over inside a heavy door. I was done being managed by people who had never once, not a single time, actually asked me what I truly wanted for myself. I simply was not ready yet to let any of them know that the lock had already quietly turned that night. The wedding itself finally took place that October at a rented vineyard just outside Columbus that probably cost more money for one single afternoon than Robert and I had spent altogether on our first 3 cars combined over an entire decade. And I danced slowly with my son underneath long strings of small white lights strung between the trees. And I smiled warmly for every single photograph the hired photographer asked of me. And I said absolutely nothing at all when Vanessa's own mother stood up during the reception dinner and gave a long, tearful toast thanking everyone who had, in her exact words, helped make this family whole again, without once mentioning that I'd quietly paid for half the flowers and nearly all of the catering myself through a private account. Nobody in that entire extended family even knew that I personally controlled. During the actual ceremony, sitting in the front pew in a lavender dress I had bought specifically for that day, I found myself thinking about Robert more than I expected to. About how he would have worn his one good gray suit and cried openly during the vows without a single ounce of embarrassment, the way he always did at every wedding we ever attended together. I thought about the two of us standing in that same kind of small chapel back in 1974, with no money, no company yet, nothing at all but a $5,000 loan, and a plan nobody believed in. And I found myself hoping quietly that whatever Vanessa and David were promising each other that day, they meant it as fully as Robert and I had meant ours. It was at the rehearsal dinner the night before the actual wedding, though, held in a private back room at a steakhouse David had specifically chosen years earlier for his own high school graduation dinner, that things went considerably further than I ever could have honestly expected, further than I had truly braced myself for, even after everything that had already happened that year. Vanessa stood up in front of both entire families, wine glass raised gracefully in one manicured hand, and after a genuinely lovely toast about love and new beginnings that brought real, honest tears to more than one set of eyes seated at that long table, she said, "And I do want to take care of one small practical thing, too. While we finally have everyone gathered together in one room tonight, because family should really handle these kinds of things with love, not with lawyers standing coldly between us." She had actual papers with her that night, real legal papers tucked neatly inside a cream-colored folder tied shut with a small silver ribbon, presented almost like it was a gift meant for careful opening, and she asked me directly, calmly, in front of nearly 40 relatives holding wine glasses that had gone completely still and silent in midair, to sign a broad general power of attorney right there at that very dinner table, so that, as she put it so sweetly, so reasonably, so lovingly, David and I can finally start handling all the small things for you properly from now on. The house, the little accounts, so that you never have to worry about a single piece of any of it ever again for the rest of your natural life. I felt every single eye in that private dining room turn slowly toward me all at once. I felt my own son's hand land gently on my shoulder, warm and clearly expectant, already believing I could tell instantly from his face that I would simply say yes without hesitation, because saying no out loud in front of that many gathered relatives on the very eve of his own wedding day would instantly and permanently make me the difficult one, the ungrateful one. the stubborn mother who could not gracefully accept one loving gesture from her own child on the single happiest weekend of his entire life. I smiled instead, slowly and deliberately, and I said, in a voice far steadier than I actually felt inside in that exact moment, that I would be truly honored to look everything over properly with my own personal attorney before ever signing anything quite so important, which is simply good, sound practice for any woman my age, regardless of how much genuine love might be behind the gesture itself. And I watched Vanessa's bright, carefully rehearsed smile flicker, just barely, just long enough for me to catch one clear glimpse of something cold and calculating underneath it that was most certainly not love at all. If you have ever been cornered like that yourself, asked publicly in front of an entire room of people to hand over control of your own life, dressed up neatly as a generous favor being done for you, then you already fully understand exactly why I am telling you this whole story tonight. And if it means anything real to you at all, subscribing costs absolutely nothing, not a single cent, and it quietly tells me that you genuinely want more stories about women like me speaking up carefully on our own terms and our own timeline, instead of staying silent at the table purely for the sake of somebody else's comfort and peace. The very next morning, hours before the actual wedding ceremony had even begun, I called my oldest and very dearest friend in this entire world, a sharp, steady, no-nonsense woman named Ruth Calloway, who had been Robert's own attorney since 1981 and had been quietly managing Ellison Toole and Dye's legal affairs on my direct instructions and nobody else's at all for all 11 long years since his death. "Ruth," I said, my voice shaking just slightly for the very first time in months, "I think my daughter-in-law just tried to get me to sign my entire life away, quite literally, at a rehearsal dinner in front of 40 people last night, and I need you to tell me precisely what that document actually says, and just as importantly, precisely what it does not say at all." Ruth read every single page of it carefully over that same week, twice through in full, and confirmed exactly what I'd already quietly suspected, sitting rigid at that dinner table the night before. It was broad, dangerously and quite deliberately broad, the kind of sweeping general power of attorney that could, in the wrong hands, eventually be stretched far beyond one modest little house and a single ordinary savings account. If anyone with enough patience and enough quiet curiosity ever went digging properly into the full extent of what Margaret Ellison actually owned on paper, somewhere deep inside a county filing office. Ruth sat across from me at her own office desk that week, took off her reading glasses and said, "Margaret, I have known you for over 40 years, and I am telling you plainly, do not sign this, not this version, not any version that gives anyone unrestricted authority over your accounts while you are still perfectly capable of managing them yourself." I trusted her completely, the same way Robert always had, and I told David gently that same week that I simply needed more time to review something so important properly and carefully, and I started for the very first time since Robert had died 11 years earlier, quietly watching my own son and his new wife instead of simply trusting them completely the way I always had, without a second thought. I did not sign it, not that week and not the next. I spent that entire long winter watching closely, listening far more than I ever spoke, saying almost nothing at all out loud, while Vanessa kept right on mentioning, at nearly every single family dinner we shared, how much better she would finally sleep at night once those papers were properly signed. Once she and David were officially and legally handling everything for me the way they felt they should. I let her keep right on talking, uninterrupted. Ruth had taught me a long time ago, back when Robert was still alive and personally negotiating supplier contracts late into the night, that the people most eager to move quickly on something are almost always the very same people with the most to quietly gain from you, never once stopping to ask a single hard question. And I fully intended to ask every single question I had, carefully, patiently, entirely, on my own timeline, never once on hers. By early winter, Vanessa had stopped being subtle about the timeline entirely. She started calling me twice a week instead of once, always cheerful, always circling back to the same topic, mentioning that her father had graciously offered to notarize everything himself, free of charge, as a family favor, whenever I was finally ready. She told David, within my hearing on purpose I am quite certain, that some elderly parents simply need a gentle push to do what is best for them, and that she did not want to be the kind of daughter-in-law who let pride get in the way of proper planning. I heard the word elderly in that sentence, and I thought of Robert, of the garage, of 11 years of quiet decisions nobody in that kitchen ever knew about. And I simply kept my calendar clear and my mouth closed, waiting. Ruth and I met twice that December, once at her office, and once, more carefully, at a diner 2 towns over where nobody from either family would recognize either one of us having coffee together. She walked me through exactly what a broad general power of attorney could eventually be used for, step by careful step, showing me real cases from her 40 years of practice where a well-meaning family member had ended up, years later, quietly liquidating assets an elderly parent never intended to give up, simply because the paperwork technically allowed it, and nobody had thought to stop them in time. I remember sitting in that vinyl diner booth thinking calmly, so this is what almost happened to me at my own son's rehearsal dinner, dressed up as a kindness. 3 long months after the wedding, right around Thanksgiving, I slipped badly on a patch of black ice in my own driveway one bitterly cold morning and twisted my ankle severely enough to need a heavy medical walking boot for nearly 6 full weeks afterward. It was honestly nothing more serious than that, truly a common, entirely ordinary thing that happens to plenty of women my age every single winter right across this entire country. But to Vanessa, watching quietly from her own kitchen window as David helped me limp slowly inside that afternoon, it was apparently exactly the piece of evidence she had been patiently waiting for all along. She called a formal family meeting for the Sunday right after Thanksgiving, at David and Vanessa's own house, in that same formal dining room with the good china cabinet standing against the wall, and I arrived leaning slightly on a borrowed cane to find not just my son and his wife waiting quietly for me there, but Vanessa's own father, Gerald Prescott, a semi-retired estate attorney with neat silver hair and an expensive gold watch, already seated comfortably at the head of the table with a thick leather folder laid out precisely in front of him, and a look on his face like a man who was about to close a deal he had personally been anticipating for several months already. Vanessa spoke first that afternoon, her voice soft, warm, and quite clearly rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror, more than once beforehand, saying how genuinely frightened they had all been after my sudden fall. How a woman living entirely alone at 74 with a bad ankle and an empty house simply could not be safely left to manage her own affairs any longer, and how her own father had been kind enough, purely out of deep love for this family, to prepare an entire formal guardianship petition to present properly to the court just to protect me thoroughly. Just to make absolutely certain nothing bad ever happened to what little she personally assumed I still had left in this world. Gerald opened his thick leather folder and began reading calmly through the petition in that dry, practiced official attorney's voice, the exact kind that fills a quiet room instantly and makes everyone at the table straighten slightly in their chairs without even meaning to. I sat very still directly across from him, my 2 hands folded neatly in my lap over the top of my borrowed cane, because Ruth had warned me, gently but quite firmly, that a moment exactly like this one might eventually arrive someday, and she had told me precisely what to do the very second that it finally did. Absolutely nothing at all. Just listen closely, patiently, and let the paperwork itself do every single bit of the talking for me. And then Gerald finally reached the section he had clearly prepared, with such great care to make the entire petition look thoroughly proper in front of any judge someday, the section formally listing my personal assets, pulled directly from public county and state records specifically to show any court exactly what supposedly needed protecting on my behalf. And he began reading it aloud smoothly, confidently, without ever once having actually stopped to read it carefully himself even a single time beforehand that morning. Ellison Toole and Die, he read aloud clearly, incorporated in the state of Ohio back in 1975, president and sole shareholder, Margaret A. Ellison, current estimated enterprise value, and then, without so much as a single pause in his steady rhythm, he read a number out loud, right there at that quiet dining table, a number with 7 full digits in it, and the entire room went so suddenly silent that I could clearly hear the refrigerator humming steadily away in the kitchen directly behind him. David's face changed first, draining slowly from simple confusion into something much closer to genuine shock. Then Vanessa's, the color leaving her cheeks in real time as she stared down helplessly at her own father's neatly printed paperwork, and finally understood, all at once, in front of everyone she truly loved, that the very woman she had spent 3 solid years describing to her country club friends as a burden, living off a small pension, was right there on paper, inside her own father's official court exhibit. The sole owner of a manufacturing company worth considerably more than every single house standing on Vanessa's own street combined together. Vanessa's own mother, sitting 2 chairs down, actually let out a small, startled laugh, the kind that escapes a person before they can stop it, and immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Vanessa's uncle, a quiet man named Frank, who had barely spoken 2 words to me in 3 years, turned slowly in his chair and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as genuine respect, maybe for the very first time since I had known him. Even Gerald himself, still holding the page in his own hands, glanced up at me over his reading glasses with something close to embarrassment, the look of a lawyer who suddenly realizes mid-sentence that his own careful evidence has just argued the opposite case entirely. Nobody said a single word for what genuinely felt like a very long time indeed. I finally spoke, and I kept my voice as calm, as even, and as steady as I have ever managed to keep it in my entire life. I said, "I do appreciate the concern, Gerald. Truly I do, but I believe you may have just made the strongest possible case against your own petition here today. A woman capable of quietly and successfully running a 140-person manufacturing company for 11 straight years does not need a court-appointed guardian to decide whether she is still allowed to keep her own modest house on Larkspur Lane." Vanessa tried desperately to recover in that moment, stammering something quickly about how none of this actually changed anything at all, how she had only ever truly wanted to help me. But her own father was already quietly closing his leather folder, already understanding fully as any competent attorney eventually would in his position, that he had just personally built an entirely airtight legal document proving beyond any doubt whatsoever that I did not need protecting from anyone at all. Least of all from my own family gathered closely around that very table. He looked over slowly at his daughter, and I watched him fully realize, right there in real time in front of everyone, exactly what kind of careful trap she had actually set for me, and exactly whose own hand had ended up caught firmly inside it instead. Caleb, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, where he had been placed almost as an afterthought, was the only person in that entire room who smiled at me in that moment. A small, private smile meant just for me, and later he told me he had wanted to stand up and applaud right there but thought better of it, given the circumstances. David reached over and took my hand across the table, his own hand trembling slightly, and said quietly, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" And I simply squeezed his hand back and said, "Because I was waiting to see who in this family would still love me the same way once they knew." It was not me who exposed her careful plans that particular day, and I want to be completely honest with you about that part. It was her own father's paperwork, prepared so meticulously to make her entire case look airtight and genuinely loving, that ended up becoming the very thing that proved in plain black and white ink, in front of every single person she had spent years quietly performing pity for me around, that I had never once actually needed rescuing in the first place. I did not raise my voice a single time that entire afternoon. I honestly did not have to, because the plain truth itself had already done every bit of that work for me, quietly, patiently, entirely on its own schedule. If you have ever watched someone's own careful scheme fall apart right there in their own 2 hands, in front of the very same people they had spent years trying so hard to fool, then you already understand the particular kind of quiet satisfaction I felt, sitting at that table that cold Sunday afternoon. And if this story has held your attention all the way to this point tonight, please subscribe. It is completely free of any charge, and it remains the only real way a small channel like this one keeps finding and telling stories about women who were underestimated for far, far too long by the very people who really should have known so much better. Nothing official happened overnight, of course, because guardianship petitions do not simply vanish into thin air the moment they become deeply embarrassing to the people who originally filed them. They have to be formally and properly withdrawn, in writing through all the correct legal channels, and Gerald Prescott withdrew his petition himself within the week, quietly, through a single short letter to the court clerk, without ever fully explaining to his own daughter exactly why he no longer believed it was wise to pursue any of it any further at all. David called me 3 full days later, sitting quietly in his own car outside my house rather than coming directly to the front door right away. And for the first time in years, he did not speak to me like a woman who urgently needed managing. He asked me quietly, almost sheepishly, why I had never once told him about the company all these years, and I told him the plain, honest truth, sitting together on my porch steps in the cold evening air. I told him I had watched people in this family decide over and over again, year after year, that I was less capable than I actually was, and I had simply stopped correcting them, because correcting them never once seemed to change a single thing, until, quite suddenly, on one ordinary Sunday afternoon, it finally, completely did. I did not cut Vanessa out of my life entirely after all of that, and I want you to understand that clearly. I am not that kind of woman, and she remains my son's wife regardless, and I still genuinely believe people can learn something valuable from being proven wrong in front of an entire room full of people who truly love them. But I did set a firm boundary with her that I have never once softened since that particular Sunday, telling her plainly over coffee a few quiet weeks later that respect is simply not something I owe automatically anymore to anyone in this family, that it is something which now has to be earned back, slowly, patiently, the exact same way trust always must be rebuilt after it has once been broken. If you have ever had to draw a line like that with someone in your own family, a line that quietly says, I still love you, but I no longer hand you my dignity for free just to keep everyone else comfortable, I want you to know that drawing that particular line is completely allowed. It is not bitterness, and it never truly was. It is simply what genuine self-respect looks like, once you finally stop apologizing for having it in the first place. And if this particular story has meant anything real to you tonight, please share it gently with somebody in your own life who badly needs to hear it. It costs absolutely nothing at all, and it truly means the world to a small channel like this one that is only trying its best to keep going. Caleb, David's son from his brief first marriage, the only member of that entire extended family who had ever once visited me simply to visit me, with absolutely no hidden agenda quietly folded into the conversation, started coming by every other Sunday afternoon after that whole ordeal, and we would sit together on my porch in the fading golden light, and he would ask me real, genuine questions about his grandfather Robert, about the company itself, about what it had truly felt like to build something lasting out of a rented cinder-block garage with 2 second-hand lathes and one small loan that almost nobody around us had ever truly believed in at the start. I made him my official successor on the company's board 2 years later, not because he had ever once asked me for it directly, and certainly not because he expected anything at all from me in return for his kindness, but simply because he was the only person in that entire family who had ever loved me, plainly and openly, without ever once needing something back in exchange for it. David asked quietly a few months later whether he could come learn the business properly, starting from the shop floor like his father once had, and I said yes, on one condition, that he would learn it the same slow way Robert and I built it, one honest year at a time, with no shortcuts handed to him simply for carrying our name. He works there now in the operations office, and he is good at it, better than I expected, and every Friday he calls me just to tell me one small thing that went right that week, the way his father used to do at our own kitchen table decades ago. Ruth retired from her practice 2 years ago, though she still comes by my house most Thursday evenings, and we sit on the same porch where I now spend most of my quiet afternoons and talk about everything except the company, because after 11 years of carrying it together in secret, we finally earned the right to talk about something else entirely, like her grandchildren, or her garden, or simply nothing at all. She was there the day Robert's name went back up on a small brass plaque outside the main office right next to mine, the way it always should have been from the very beginning. I still live in that very same house on Larkspur Lane today, in the same familiar rooms where Robert and I raised our son together. I never did move into that retirement community with the little shuttle bus and the tidy shared dining hall that Vanessa found for me all those years ago. I still drive myself to the grocery store every single week without any help, and I still personally sign every check that truly matters at Ellison Tool and Die, because it turns out a woman does not lose her sound mind, her sharp judgment, or her true worth the very moment she turns 70 years old, no matter how convenient certain people might find it, to quietly forget that plain fact whenever it happens to suit their own purposes. Vanessa and I are civil with each other now, cordial even, especially around the holidays when the whole extended family gathers together at David's house. She has never once apologized to me outright, not in so many exact words, but she no longer speaks about my little pension in front of strangers at the hair salon, and she no longer gently suggests in that same soft, rehearsed voice that somebody responsible really ought to be handling my affairs for me instead. Some corrections in this life simply do not need a formal apology attached to them at all. Sometimes the correction is simply the long, comfortable silence that follows afterward, once everybody sitting at the table has finally understood the whole truth entirely on their own, without needing to be told twice. If there is only one single thing I truly want you to carry away from my story tonight, let it be this. Never let anyone else decide, on your own behalf, how much you are still fully capable of, how much you still genuinely matter, or how much of your own remaining life you still fully deserve to control for yourself. People will very often mistake your quiet kindness, your patience, your calm refusal to fight loudly out in public for outright weakness, and that particular mistake belongs entirely to them to make, never to you to correct with anything more than steady patience and eventual, undeniable proof. I spent decades quietly letting people underestimate me because it was always so much easier than arguing back loudly at every single family dinner table, and I do not regret that long silence, not really, not even now. But I will tell you honestly right here tonight that the day the whole truth finally came out on its own, in someone else's careful paperwork, in someone else's own confident voice, felt exactly like laying down a heavy weight I had not even fully realized I was still quietly carrying after 50 long years of my life. Wherever you happen to be sitting tonight, in whatever room, in whatever kind of family that is quietly counting you out of decisions they privately think you are too old, too tired, or too soft to make for yourself anymore, I want you to remember one important thing. Being underestimated is not a life sentence handed down to you forever. It is simply a temporary window of time before the plain truth eventually finds its own quiet way into the room, and it genuinely always does, sooner or later, one way or another, whether anyone sitting at that table ever bothers to invite it in themselves. Thank you, truly and sincerely, for staying with me all the way to the very end of this one tonight. If my story reminded you even a little of your own life or perhaps of someone you dearly love, please subscribe. Share it gently with them and leave me a comment, simply letting me know that you made it all the way to the end. It genuinely does not cost you a single thing at all, and it remains the only real reason small channels like this one get to keep telling stories about women exactly like me. I will see you warmly in the very next one.